Somewhere deep inside a limestone ridge, two teams of men are working in near total darkness. They are not digging in a straight line. They are crawling through the bedrock beneath Jerusalem, widening a jagged natural fissure in the rock, swinging picks in spaces barely wide enough for their shoulders, following the crack wherever it runs. The air is thin. The smoke from their oil lamps fills the tunnel. They have been digging from opposite ends for months, trying to connect a water source to the city before the most lethal army in the ancient world arrives at their walls. They cannot see each other. They cannot hear each other. They can only follow the stone. And then, through a wall of rock barely 1.5 meters thick, a voice comes through. The chisel breaks clear. Cold spring water moves through the darkness for the first time, running invisibly beneath the city, sealed from any enemy standing outside the walls. Near the breakthrough point, the workers scratch a few lines into the stone. A record, a note. We did this. That note is still there. This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, the reign of Hezekiah, king of Judah, a man who faced the most powerful military machine of the ancient world, carved a water tunnel through the solid bedrock of Jerusalem and left behind some of the most remarkable archaeological evidence of any figure in the entire biblical record. By the final decades of the 8th century BC, the ancient Near East had reorganized itself around a single center of gravity, Assyria. The Assyrian Empire in this period was not simply a powerful state. It was an administrative and military machine of a kind the ancient world had rarely seen. A standing army with sophisticated siege technology, a systematic policy of mass deportation for conquered populations, and a bureaucratic structure that absorbed defeated kingdoms as governed provinces, rather than leaving them intact as tributaries. The Assyrians documented their campaigns obsessively. Their kings carved victories into stone monuments and clay cylinders, and those records survive. When an Assyrian king wrote that he had swept through a landscape, the archaeology tends to confirm he meant it. The kingdom of Judah in this world was a small highland state centered on Jerusalem, sitting on a narrow ridge above the Kidron Valley at an elevation just over 750 meters. It was not a great power. What it had was a defensible position, a functioning administrative system, and one critical vulnerability: its primary water supply. The Gihon Spring, which had fed Jerusalem for centuries, emerged from the valley floor to the east, outside the main walls. In a siege, any army that controlled that valley controlled the city's water. By around 722 BC, Judah's northern neighbor, the Kingdom of Israel, had ceased to exist. Sargon II of Assyria had taken Samaria, deported a substantial part of its population, and replaced them with settlers from elsewhere in the empire. The biblical and Assyrian records are broadly in agreement on this. The northern kingdom was gone, and Judah now shared a border with an Assyrian provincial boundary. The question facing Hezekiah was not whether Assyria was a threat. It was how long there was to prepare. Hezekiah comes to the throne of Judah facing a world his father Ahaz had navigated by accommodation, paying tribute, keeping his head down, surviving by submission. The accounts in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and the book of Isaiah describe a king who chose a different path and who understood that choosing it would eventually require Jerusalem to hold. His response operates on two registers at once. The first is religious. He initiates sweeping reforms, the removal of high places, the clearing of the temple courts, the destruction of the bronze serpent called Nehushtan, which the biblical text claims had been preserved since the wilderness wanderings of the Exodus, and which had by this point become an object of worship in its own right. The second is material and systematic, and it is the register that leaves the most tangible trace. The book of Chronicles records Hezekiah consulting with his officials and deciding to stop up the springs outside Jerusalem, denying water to any army in the valley below, while securing water inside the walls. The prophet Isaiah, writing from within the same period, describes the city tearing down houses to reinforce the outer wall. The archaeology of Jerusalem has found that wall, excavated in the Jewish quarter of the Old City by Nachman Avegad in the 1970s. It is a broad defensive structure over 7 meters thick in places, dated to the late 8th century BC. It is known simply as the Broad Wall, and it is almost certainly what Isaiah was describing when he wrote that Hezekiah had torn down houses to make the circuit of the walls stronger. The physical remains of that demolition, crushed domestic pottery beneath the wall's foundation courses, were still visible in Avigad's trenches. But the most extraordinary of Hezekiah's preparations runs beneath the city itself. The Gihon Spring had supplied Jerusalem for well over 1,000 years before Hezekiah's engineers came to it. What his teams conceived was a tunnel that would redirect the spring's flow entirely through the bedrock beneath the city, delivering the water to a reservoir within the walls now called the Pool of Siloam, while concealing and blocking the original opening to the valley. No enemy standing outside the walls would be able to see where the water was going or stop it. 2 Kings records the result with characteristic brevity. He made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city. What was cut into the rock ran 533 meters from the spring to the pool, driven from both ends simultaneously. The tunnel does not run straight. It bends and curves through the ridge along a route that engineers and geologists have studied for well over a century. The most widely held explanation, associated with geologist Dan Gill among others, is that the workers were not navigating blindly. They were following and enlarging a pre-existing natural dissolution channel in the limestone, a karst fissure the rock had already partially formed. The winding path is the path the stone itself had already opened. That is why the tunnel meanders rather than driving toward the shortest route. They were reading the geology by touch, in the dark, working inward from opposite ends with no way to see or hear each other across the stone between them. The floor levels required adjustment where the two sections finally met. The Siloam Inscription, scratched into the tunnel wall near the breakthrough point, records what happened at the end. The workers heard each other's voices through the final thin wall of rock, with only roughly 1.5 meters of stone remaining. That moment of contact, the voice coming through the dark, was apparently significant enough to record. The inscription does not treat it as engineering genius. It records it with something closer to relief. The inscription itself was found in 1880 when a local boy exploring the tunnel noticed markings in the stone and reported them. It is written in a form of ancient Hebrew, whose letter shapes date it with reasonable confidence to the late 8th century BC, consistent with Hezekiah's reign. It does not name the king. It does not invoke royal authority. It is the voice of workers, a note left in the dark about what it cost to push through. The inscription was later cut from the tunnel wall and removed to Istanbul, where it remains in the Archaeological Museum. While Hezekiah was reinforcing Jerusalem, Assyria was moving. In 701 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib launched a campaign into the Levant that is among the most extensively documented military operations in the entire biblical period, recorded not only in 2 Kings and Isaiah, but in the surviving records of the Assyrian court itself. Sennacherib's army moves through the lowland cities of Judah with systematic efficiency. The biblical text records the fall of Lachish, a fortified city southwest of Jerusalem that commanded the main road into the Judean heartland. The Assyrian record does not simply mention it in passing. The capture of Lachish is depicted across an entire gallery of carved stone reliefs from Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh, now in the British Museum. The panels show the assault in extraordinary detail. Siege ramps of packed earth and stone driven up against the city walls, battering rams advancing under covering fire, archers in disciplined formation, defenders throwing torches down from the ramparts, and, running along the bottom of the composition, lines of captives leaving the city. Lachish fell. That is not in dispute. The record of the campaign carved onto the clay prism now known as the Taylor Prism states plainly that Sennacherib took 46 fortified cities of Judah, deported their populations, and shut Hezekiah up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Not captured, not destroyed, besieged, and held there. The siege of Jerusalem plays out in the biblical text with an unusual density of reported speech. Sennacherib sends a senior official, the Rabshakeh, a title rather than a personal name, referring to a high royal officer, to stand outside the walls and deliver terms in Hebrew, so the population on the ramparts can hear them directly. The speech is a calculated piece of psychological operation. Hezekiah's reforms have removed the very altars where the people prayed. Why would God protect a king who did that? Egypt is a broken staff that will impale any hand that leans on it. No god of any nation Assyria has defeated so far has saved them. Why would this one be different? The text records that no one answered him. Hezekiah tears his clothes when the message is reported to him and goes to the temple. Isaiah sends word to the king, "This army will not enter the city. It will hear a rumor and return to its own land." What follows in the biblical account is among the most discussed passages in the entire conquest literature. The angel of the Lord passes through the Assyrian camp in the night, and in the morning the siege is over. Sennacherib withdraws to Nineveh. The Assyrian record does not describe what happened outside Jerusalem's walls. It records the siege, records tribute paid, and moves on, without claiming to have taken the city. This is worth understanding in context. Assyrian royal records were instruments of propaganda, designed to project unbroken victory. They routinely omitted military setbacks, logistical failures, and disasters in the field. Their silence on the events at Jerusalem is fully consistent with that pattern. and does not, on its own, confirm or deny any particular account of what ended the siege. Whether the cause was plague in the camp, logistical collapse, political crisis elsewhere in the empire, or the biblical account of divine intervention, the documentary record does not resolve it. What it confirms is that Jerusalem did not fall. Sennacherib returned to Nineveh, where he reigned for another 2 decades. Roughly 20 years after the siege, in 681 BC, he was assassinated by his own sons while worshiping in the temple of his god, just as 2 Kings records. Hezekiah's story does not close with the withdrawal of the Assyrian army. 2 Kings describes a serious illness, a potentially fatal growth, from which Hezekiah recovers after Isaiah delivers the message that he will live 15 more years. Then ambassadors arrive from Babylon. The Babylonian king Merodach-Baladan, himself a persistent thorn in Assyria's side, twice briefly king of Babylon before being driven out, sends envoys to Jerusalem, ostensibly to congratulate Hezekiah on his recovery. Hezekiah shows them everything: the treasury, the armory, the storehouses, the palace. Isaiah's response is calm and absolute. A time will come when everything shown to these men will be carried to Babylon. Hezekiah's response has puzzled and divided readers ever since. He says simply, "The word of the Lord you have spoken is good. There will be peace and security in my lifetime." Some read this as a profound submission, a king accepting divine judgment without argument. Others read it as something considerably less comfortable, a man expressing relief that the catastrophe will fall on his children, not on him. The text does not settle the question. It records the words and moves on. The archaeological case for Hezekiah is unusually dense by the standards of ancient biblical figures. Clay seal impressions bearing the text belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, have been recovered in multiple instances. For some years, these beuli were known only through the antiquities market, lacking secure archaeological provenance. That changed in 2015, when Eilat Mazar's excavations at the Ophel in Jerusalem recovered a Hezekiah beula from a controlled stratigraphic context, the first confirmed find from a proper archaeological dig. It removed the principal objection to the others. Storage jar handles stamped with the Hebrew phrase Lamelech, meaning belonging to the king, appear in large numbers at sites across Judah, concentrated in layers dated to the late 8th century BC. Scholars broadly interpret them as evidence of the administrative preparations associated with Hezekiah's defensive buildup. Commodities stored or distributed under royal control, likely connected to provisioning fortified cities before the Assyrian campaign. Some scholarly debate continues about the precise administrative function of the Lamelech system, and caution should be applied before treating any single interpretation as settled. On the tunnel specifically, the attribution to Hezekiah is the mainstream scholarly position, and the paleographic dating of the Siloam inscription to the late 8th century BC is generally accepted. However, no text within the tunnel names the king. The attribution rests on the convergence of the inscription's date, the biblical description in 2 Chronicles, and the archaeological context of the broad wall and related defensive works. A strong circumstantial case widely accepted, but not epigraphically confirmed in the strict sense. A radiocarbon study of organic material in the tunnel's plaster, published by Amos Frumkin and colleagues in 2003, placed construction in the Late Iron Age consistent with Hezekiah's reign, though the study's methodology has been questioned by other researchers and should be understood as supporting evidence rather than independent confirmation. The Sennacherib Prism remains the most significant external document in this story. It is contemporaneous, carved in Sennacherib's own reign, and its account of the 701 BC campaign is detailed and specific. Its failure to record the capture of Jerusalem is widely regarded by scholars, including Nahdav Nahman, as consistent with the biblical account that the city did not fall. But Assyrian annals were propaganda, and reading their silences requires care. What the documentary record establishes is that Jerusalem survived. The cause of the Assyrian withdrawal remains an open historical question. Hezekiah survives in the historical record exactly as a king should, stamped on royal clay seals, described in the annals of his enemies, and preserved in the books of his prophets. His name is confirmed. His preparations are visible in the ground. The broad wall still stands in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, above streets he never walked. But the tunnel that may have saved the city does not carry his name. The inscription near the breakthrough point records no king, no royal decree, no divine commission. It records workers, the sound of a voice through rock, the cold water moving in the dark. Men who had done something extraordinary and wanted it marked. The most powerful army of the Iron Age camped outside Jerusalem and eventually turned back. The city endured. But the Siloam Inscription was not carved by the king who ordered the work, or the prophet who promised its protection, or the officer who reported its completion. It was left by the men who swung the chisels. That the king's name is now recovered on clay seals in a museum, and the workers left no names at all, only a description of what they heard and felt in the last moments of the dig, is a symmetry the story never resolves. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.